He read it by accident, a yellow piece of paper clipped to the chain-link fence. Territory Reconstruction Project. Demolition of Object 14B, scheduled for completion November 15th. Nobody had asked the families. Nobody had asked the community. City officials had simply decided that 43 years of remembrance was long enough. Andrew drew. Valenti adjusted his grip on the disposable coffee cup in his hand, steam rising into the crisp Pennsylvania morning air as he stared at the demolition notice. The coffee had gone cold while he read the bureaucratic language 3 times, trying to make sense of words that felt like a punch to the stomach delivered in legal terminology. Behind the fence, the Ridgeview County War Memorial stood with the quiet dignity of something built to last forever. It was not an elaborate structure, just a simple stone archway with bronze plaques arranged in chronological order, bearing the names of local sons and daughters who had given their lives in conflicts spanning from World War I through the ongoing operations in the Middle East. The memorial had been erected in 1981, when the community had pooled its resources to create a place where grief could find expression and sacrifice could be honored. Over the decades, it had become a gathering point for Memorial Day ceremonies, Veterans Day observances, and the quiet private visits of families who needed a physical place to connect with memories that lived too large for words. If you enjoy our stories and want to support our channel, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps our channel grow. Now, let's return to our story. Drew had not planned to stop by the memorial that morning. His Tuesday routine typically involved a direct route from his apartment to the law office where he worked as a civil rights attorney, with a stop at Murphy's Coffee for the large dark roast that helped him face another day of depositions and case files. But a detour caused by road construction had taken him past the memorial, and something about the yellow paper fluttering in the November wind had caught his attention. Now, reading the demolition notice for the 3rd time, Drew felt the familiar tightness in his chest that he associated with moments when the past and present collided in ways he was not prepared to handle. The notice was dated 2 weeks earlier, which meant the demolition was scheduled to begin in less than 72 hours. Object 14B. That was how the city had designated the memorial in their paperwork, not as a sacred space or a place of remembrance, but as an object to be removed in the name of progress and urban development. Drew crumpled the empty coffee cup in his hand, the cardboard making a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet morning air. He had served 4 years in Iraq as a combat medic with the United States Army, and he had learned to control his emotional responses to situations that threatened to overwhelm him. But standing in front of this memorial, reading about its planned destruction, he felt something breaking loose inside him that had been carefully contained for nearly 2 decades. He pushed through the unlocked gate in the chain-link fence, a gate that had never been locked because the memorial had always been considered community property, accessible to anyone who needed to visit. The morning air was sharp with the promise of winter, and his breath was visible as he walked slowly toward the bronze plaques that held the names of the honored dead. The plaques were arranged chronologically, starting with the Great War and proceeding through each subsequent conflict. Drew's eyes moved automatically to the section dedicated to Operation Iraqi Freedom, where the most recent additions to the memorial had been made. The bronze still looked newer than the rest, not yet weathered by years of Pennsylvania winters. 3rd name from the right, 2nd row, Nicholas P. Valenti, Specialist, United States Army, 2005. Drew's younger brother had been 22 years old when an improvised explosive device had detonated near his convoy outside Fallujah. According to the official report, Nicholas had died instantly, along with 2 other soldiers in his unit. According to the letters Drew had received from Nicholas's squad leader, his brother had been the kind of soldier who volunteered for the dangerous assignments and looked out for the newer recruits with the protective instinct of someone who understood that survival often depended on teamwork and trust. Drew reached out to touch his brother's name, his fingers tracing the raised bronze letters that represented a life cut short and a family forever changed. The metal was cold against his skin, but solid, permanent, real in a way that memories sometimes were not. He had not visited the memorial in over a year, not because he had forgotten Nicholas or because the grief had diminished, but because he had learned to carry his brother's memory in other ways, through his work as an attorney, through his commitment to helping veterans navigate the legal system, through the quiet daily choices that honored the values Nicholas had died defending. But standing here now, Reading about the planned demolition, Drew realized that he had been taking the memorial's existence for granted. He had assumed it would always be here, a physical anchor for the community's collective memory, a place where Nicholas's name would remain visible and honored for generations to come. The demolition notice had shattered that assumption with the efficiency of bureaucratic indifference. Drew pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and searched for information about the city council meeting where this decision had been made. It took him several minutes to find the relevant minutes buried in the municipal website, but when he located them, the discussion was brief and seemingly final. Motion to approve the redevelopment of Memorial Park as part of the downtown revitalization project. The current war memorial structure will be removed and replaced with a modern community gathering space featuring updated amenities and universal accessibility features. The vote had been 5-2 in favor of demolition, with minimal public discussion recorded in the official minutes. There was no mention of consulting with veterans organizations, no reference to alternative locations for the memorial, no acknowledgement that the current war memorial structure contained the names of 43 local residents who had died in service to their country. Drew scrolled through his phone, looking for local news coverage of the decision, but found nothing. The demolition of the memorial had not been considered newsworthy enough to warrant media attention. It was simply a municipal decision about land use and urban planning, filed away in the bureaucratic machinery of local government. He walked slowly around the memorial, reading names he had read dozens of times before, but seeing them now with the urgency that came from knowing they might soon be erased. Some of the names belonged to men he had known personally, friends of his father who had served in Vietnam, older brothers of his classmates who had been killed in the Gulf War. Others were strangers whose service had preceded his own birth, but whose presence on the memorial connected him to a continuum of sacrifice that stretched back through generations of American history. The memorial was not elaborate, but it was dignified. The stone archway framed a view of the surrounding park, creating a contemplative space that invited reflection without demanding attention. Families had left flowers, small American flags, and personal mementos at the base of the bronze plaques. Someone had recently placed a fresh wreath near the Vietnam section, the red ribbon still bright against the bronze. Drew understood the city's practical concerns. The memorial occupied valuable real estate in the heart of downtown Ridgeview, and the surrounding park was indeed showing its age. The accessibility issues were real. The memorial had been built before current standards for universal design, and the gravel pathways would be difficult for visitors using wheelchairs or walking aids. But understanding the practical arguments did not make them acceptable. There were ways to address accessibility concerns without destroying the memorial entirely. There were methods of urban redevelopment that could incorporate existing monuments rather than erasing them. The decision to demolish seemed driven less by necessity than by the desire to start fresh, to create something new rather than preserve something meaningful. Drew's phone buzzed with a text message from his office, reminding him about a client meeting scheduled for 9 o'clock. He looked at the time and realized he had been standing at the memorial for nearly an hour, lost in thoughts that circled around the same fundamental question. What was he going to do about this? As a civil rights attorney, he understood the legal processes involved in municipal decision-making. He knew how to file appeals, how to request injunctions, how to challenge government decisions in court. But he also knew that legal processes took time, and the demolition was scheduled to begin in less than 3 days. He also knew, from his experience as a veteran and as someone who had lost a family member to military service, that sometimes the most important battles were not fought in courtrooms, but in the realm of public opinion and community conscience. Drew took a final photograph of Nicholas's name on the bronze plaque, then walked slowly back toward the gate in the chain-link fence. His coffee had long since gone cold, and his Tuesday morning routine had been thoroughly disrupted. But as he drove toward his office, he was already formulating a plan that would disrupt much more than his daily schedule. The city council had made their decision in the absence of public attention and community input. They had treated the memorial as Object 14B, a bureaucratic item to be disposed of in the name of progress. Drew Valenti, Iraq War veteran, civil rights attorney, and brother of specialist Nicholas P. Valenti, was about to remind them that some objects could not be so easily erased. The demolition was scheduled to begin Thursday morning at 8 o'clock. Drew planned to be there when the bulldozers arrived. He just had not decided yet whether he would be there as a lawyer with legal documents or as a brother with nothing to lose. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of gray Pennsylvania sky that made everything look worn and tired. Drew Valenti had not slept well, spending most of the night alternating between legal research and staring at the ceiling of his apartment, trying to convince himself that what he was planning to do was reasonable rather than reckless. At 6:30 in the morning, he dressed in his best suit, a charcoal gray three-piece that he normally reserved for important court appearances, and carefully knotted his university tie. If he was going to make a stand, he wanted to look like someone who deserved to be taken seriously. The irony was not lost on him that he was dressing for what might be the most important moment of his civilian life the same way he had once prepared for military inspections. The drive to the memorial took 12 minutes through the empty streets of downtown Ridgeview. Drew had called in sick to work, something he had not done in over 3 years, leaving a message on his assistant's voicemail that he had a family emergency that required his immediate attention. It was not entirely a lie. Nicholas was still family, even 19 years after his death, and the destruction of his memorial certainly qualified as an emergency. When Drew arrived at Memorial Park, the demolition crew was already setting up their equipment. 2 large trucks were parked on the street, and workers in hard hats and reflective vests were unloading traffic cones and surveying equipment. A bulldozer sat on a flatbed trailer, waiting to be deployed for the systematic destruction of 43 years of community memory. The foreman, a middle-aged man with calloused hands and the easy confidence of someone who had supervised hundreds of demolition projects, was consulting a clipboard and pointing toward various sections of the memorial. To him, this was simply another job, another structure to be removed efficiently and safely. He had no way of knowing that each bronze plaque represented a family's worst day, that each name carved in stone marked the end of someone's hopes and dreams. Drew parked across the street and sat in his car for several minutes, watching the preparations and trying to summon the courage for what he knew he had to do. His phone had been buzzing all morning with messages from colleagues and friends, but he had ignored them all. This moment required a clarity of purpose that could not accommodate second-guessing or well-meaning advice. At exactly 8 o'clock, the foreman gave a signal to his crew, and the bulldozer was driven off its trailer with the mechanical precision of heavy equipment operated by skilled professionals. The machine was enormous, painted bright yellow, with steel treads that could crush concrete, and a blade that could reduce the memorial to rubble in less than an hour. Drew stepped out of his car, straightened his tie, and picked up the leather briefcase that contained legal documents he hoped he would not need to use. He walked across the street with measured steps, his dress shoes clicking against the asphalt with a rhythm that reminded him of military cadence. The demolition crew noticed him approaching, but they continued with their preparations. Civilians sometimes gathered to watch demolition projects, drawn by curiosity about the destructive power of heavy machinery. The foreman glanced in Drew's direction but showed no concern about a well-dressed man with a briefcase standing near their work site. Drew reached the chain-link fence surrounding the memorial and stopped directly in front of the gate. The bulldozer was positioning itself for the first pass, its engine rumbling with the kind of mechanical power that could reshape landscapes and erase history with equal efficiency. Then Drew did something that surprised everyone present, including himself. He opened the gate, walked through it, and positioned himself directly between the bulldozer and the memorial. He set his briefcase down carefully on the gravel path, straightened his jacket, and stood at attention with the bearing of a soldier reporting for duty. He did not shout or wave his arms or attempt to engage the demolition crew in conversation. He simply stood there, motionless and silent, a human barrier between the machine and the monument that contained his brother's name. The bulldozer operator, a young man probably in his 20s, immediately shut off his engine. The sudden silence was so complete that Drew could hear birds singing in the oak trees that bordered the park. The foreman dropped his clipboard and walked quickly toward the fence, his expression shifting from routine concentration to genuine concern. "Sir," the foreman called out, his voice carrying the kind of professional politeness that people used when they were trying to avoid escalating a situation. "Sir, you need to move away from the work area. This is an active construction site." Drew did not respond. He kept his eyes fixed on the memorial behind him, focusing on the bronze plaque that held Nicholas's name. He could feel the weight of the bulldozer operator's confusion, the foreman's growing anxiety, and the curious stares of the other workers, but he remained motionless. "Sir," the foreman tried again, his voice louder now. "I need you to step back behind the fence. We have a job to complete here, and your presence creates a safety hazard." Still, Drew said nothing. He had learned during his military service that silence could be more powerful than words, that sometimes the most effective way to communicate was to refuse to communicate at all. His presence spoke louder than any argument he could have made about the value of preserving the memorial. Within minutes, someone had called the police. Drew heard the sirens approaching before he saw the patrol cars, and he felt a familiar tightness in his chest that reminded him of other moments in his life when consequences had been unavoidable. But he did not move from his position. Two police officers approached the fence with the cautious body language of professionals who were trying to assess a situation they had not encountered before. The older officer, a sergeant with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had seen most of what small-town police work had to offer, stepped forward. "Good morning, sir," the sergeant said, his voice neutral but not unfriendly. "I am Sergeant Martinez with the Ridgeview Police Department. We received a call about a situation here. Can you tell me what is going on?" Drew turned slightly to face the officer, but he remained standing in front of the memorial. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear, carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from years of making decisions under pressure. "My name is Andrew Valenti," he said. "I am a veteran of the Iraq War and a licensed attorney in the state of Pennsylvania. I am engaging in peaceful civil disobedience to prevent the destruction of this memorial, which contains the name of my brother, Specialist Nicholas Valenti, who was killed in action in 2005. The sergeant's expression shifted slightly, and Drew could see recognition dawning in the man's eyes. Sergeant Martinez was probably a veteran himself, Drew realized, someone who understood the weight of military service and the significance of memorials to fallen soldiers. "Mr. Valenti," the sergeant said, "I understand your concerns, but you are currently trespassing on city property and interfering with a lawfully authorized demolition project. I need to ask you to move back behind the fence so that these workers can complete their job safely." "I understand the legal situation, Sergeant," Drew replied. "I am prepared to accept the consequences of my actions, but I will not move from this position while this memorial is under threat of destruction." The standoff lasted for nearly an hour, with the demolition crew growing increasingly frustrated and the police officers trying to find a way to resolve the situation without making an arrest that would inevitably attract media attention. Drew remained motionless throughout the negotiations, his presence serving as a physical manifestation of the community's failure to protect something precious. It was the bulldozer operator who finally broke the stalemate. The young man climbed down from his machine and approached the fence, removing his hard hat as he walked. When he spoke, his voice carried the uncertainty of someone who was questioning something he had taken for granted. "Excuse me," he said, addressing both Drew and the police officers. "I have got a question. If this guy's brother's name is on that memorial, and the guy's a veteran himself, why are we tearing it down? I mean, what did these soldiers do wrong that we have to erase their names?" The question hung in the air like a challenge that no one was prepared to answer. The foreman consulted his clipboard again, looking for bureaucratic guidance that was not there. The police officers exchanged glances that suggested they were no longer certain about the righteousness of their position. The demolition crew gathered near their trucks, their body language indicating that they were no longer entirely comfortable with the job they had been hired to perform. Drew felt something shifting in the atmosphere around the memorial, a change in the emotional weather that suggested his silent protest was achieving something he had not dared to hope for. He was no longer standing alone against the machinery of municipal indifference. He was standing at the center of a conversation about memory and value and the responsibilities that communities owe to their honored dead. But he still did not move from his position, because he understood that the moment he stepped aside, the bulldozer would resume its work, and Nicholas's name would be reduced to bronze fragments and stone dust. So he remained standing, silent and motionless, while around him the morning began to transform from a routine demolition project into something much more significant and much more difficult to resolve. His phone had been buzzing intermittently in his jacket pocket, but he ignored it. Whatever messages were accumulating could wait. This moment, this confrontation between past and present, between memory and progress, between one man's grief and a city's plans, required his complete attention. The sun was beginning to break through the gray Pennsylvania clouds, casting shadows across the memorial and illuminating the bronze plaques that held the names of the honored dead. Drew could see Nicholas's name clearly from his position, and he found strength in the knowledge that his brother would have understood why this stand was necessary. Some battles, Drew had learned during his military service, were worth fighting even when victory was uncertain. Some principles were worth defending even when the cost was high. Some names were worth protecting even when the world seemed determined to forget them. He adjusted his stance slightly, settling in for what he suspected would be a very long day. By 10 o'clock in the morning, everything had changed. What had begun as a routine demolition project had transformed into something that no one, not the city officials, not the police, not Drew himself, had anticipated. Word of the standoff had spread through Ridgeview with the velocity that only comes when a story touches something deep and universal in the human experience. The first person to arrive was Margaret Shun, a local teacher who had lost her son in Afghanistan 3 years earlier. She parked across the street and simply stood beside her car, watching Drew's solitary vigil with tears streaming down her cheeks. She did not approach the fence or attempt to join the protest. She just bore witness, her presence adding weight to Drew's silent statement. Then came Robert Torres, a Vietnam veteran in his 70s who walked with a cane and wore a faded army jacket covered in unit patches. He positioned himself near Margaret, nodding once in Drew's direction with the kind of respect that one soldier shows another. Behind him came 3 more veterans, then a family with young children, then an elderly couple who held hands and whispered quietly to each other. By 11 o'clock, nearly 50 people had gathered in the small park. They formed an informal semicircle around the memorial, creating a human barrier that reinforced Drew's physical one. The demolition crew found themselves surrounded by community members who were no longer willing to let the destruction proceed without bearing witness to what was being lost. The moment that changed everything came when a young woman with a professional camera approached the fence. Sarah Walsh was a freelance journalist who had been monitoring police scanners when she heard about the situation at Memorial Park. What she found was a story that went far beyond a simple trespassing incident. "Excuse me," she called out to Drew, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Can you tell me why you are standing there? What does this memorial mean to you?" For hours, Drew had maintained his silence, speaking only to the police officers and only when directly addressed about legal matters. But something about the reporter's question and the growing crowd of supporters behind him made him realize that his silent protest had reached a moment where words might be more powerful than continued silence. He turned slightly to face the reporter, his position still blocking the bulldozers' access to the memorial, but his body language indicating that he was ready to explain what had brought him to this point. "My brother Nicholas was 22 years old when he died in Iraq," Drew said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "He was killed by an improvised explosive device while protecting other soldiers in his unit." According to his squad leader, Nicholas had put himself between the explosion and 3 younger soldiers who were new to combat. The reporter was recording everything, but Drew found that he was no longer speaking just to her. He was addressing the entire community that had gathered to watch this confrontation between memory and progress. For 19 years, his name has been preserved on this memorial, along with the names of 42 other men and women from this county who gave their lives in service to our country. This morning, the city decided that their sacrifice was less important than a redevelopment project. A murmur of anger and disbelief rippled through the crowd. Many of the gathered community members were learning for the first time about the planned demolition, having been drawn to the park by curiosity about the police presence rather than advanced knowledge of the memorial's fate. "I am not standing here because I oppose progress or development," Drew continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm. "I am standing here because some things are more important than progress. Some names deserve to be remembered, not because it is convenient or profitable, but because forgetting them diminishes all of us." Margaret Chin stepped forward, her voice breaking as she spoke. "My son David's name is on that memorial too. He was 19. He had never been away from home before he deployed." She paused, gathering herself. "Nobody told me they were going to tear this down. Nobody asked if it mattered to his family. Other voices joined hers. Robert Torres spoke about his Vietnam service and the friends whose names were carved in stone. A young mother talked about bringing her children to the memorial every Veterans Day to teach them about sacrifice and service. An elderly man whose father had died in World War II explained that this memorial was the only place where his father's service was publicly honored. The reporter continued recording, capturing not just Drew's protest, but the outpouring of community sentiment that his stand had unleashed. Within an hour, her footage was being shared on social media platforms, accompanied by hashtags like #SaveTheMemorial and #ValentiStance. The police officers found themselves in an increasingly difficult position. What had started as a simple trespassing situation had evolved into a community gathering that was both peaceful and politically charged. Sergeant Martinez made several phone calls to his superiors, seeking guidance on how to handle a situation that was attracting media attention and community support. At noon, Mayor Patricia Hendricks arrived at the memorial site, accompanied by 2 city council members and an obvious sense of political damage control. She was a woman in her 50s who had built her career on pragmatic governance and efficient municipal management, but she had not anticipated the emotional firestorm that the memorial demolition would create. The mayor approached the fence with the careful body language of a politician who was trying to appear both authoritative and sympathetic. When she spoke, her voice carried the practiced tone of someone who was accustomed to managing public relations crises. "Mr. Valenti," she said, "I want you to know that the City Council deeply respects your service and your loss. We never intended to cause pain to the families of our fallen heroes. But you must understand that we have legal obligations and safety concerns that require us to proceed with this project." Drew studied the mayor's face, seeing political calculation mixed with what might have been genuine concern. When he responded, his voice remained steady but carried an edge of steel that had not been there earlier. "Madam Mayor, with respect, your legal obligations do not override your moral obligations. You had the authority to consult with the community before making this decision. You had the opportunity to find alternatives that would preserve the memorial while addressing your development goals. Instead, you chose to treat the memory of these fallen soldiers as an obstacle to be removed." The mayor's expression tightened slightly, but she maintained her diplomatic tone. "The city is willing to explore alternative arrangements for honoring our veterans. Perhaps a plaque in the new community center or a dedicated garden space." "No," Drew interrupted, his voice cutting through her carefully prepared talking points. "You do not get to tear down their names and then offer us a consolation prize. These men and women earned their place in our community's memory through their sacrifice. That place is here, in this memorial, with their names carved in bronze and stone where future generations can see them and remember." The crowd behind Drew erupted in applause and shouts of agreement. The mayor looked around at the gathered community members, many of whom were constituents she would need to face in future elections, and Drew could see her calculating the political cost of her position. But the moment that truly shifted the balance came when a car pulled up to the curb and an elderly man in a military dress uniform stepped out. Colonel James Brennan, retired, was a decorated Vietnam veteran who served on the State Veterans Affairs Commission. He was also Margaret Chen's father-in-law and had driven 3 hours from Harrisburg when he heard about the memorial controversy. Colonel Brennan walked directly to the fence, his bearing and uniform commanding immediate attention from everyone present. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades in military leadership and was not accustomed to being ignored. "Mayor Hendricks," he said, "I served 30 years in the United States Army, including 2 tours in Vietnam and 1 in Desert Storm. I have seen what happens when communities fail to honor their obligations to the men and women who serve in uniform." He gestured toward the memorial, his movements precise and deliberate. "This memorial represents a sacred trust between this community and the families who have paid the ultimate price for our freedom. When you vote to destroy that memorial, you are breaking that trust. When you reduce the names of fallen soldiers to bureaucratic obstacles, you are dishonoring not just their memory, but the values they died defending." The colonel's words carried a moral weight that cut through the political maneuvering and bureaucratic justifications. Even the demolition crew, who had been standing near their equipment with growing uncertainty, seemed to understand that they were witnessing something more significant than a municipal dispute. Drew felt a surge of gratitude toward the colonel and the community members who had rallied to support his protest. But he also realized that the moment had come for him to make his position absolutely clear, to speak the words that would define not just this confrontation, but his brother's legacy. "Mayor Hendricks," Drew said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "I am going to make you a promise. I will stand in front of that bulldozer for as long as it takes. I will face arrest, prosecution, and any other consequences you choose to impose. Because my brother died believing that some things are worth fighting for, and his memory is one of those things." He paused, looking directly at the mayor with an intensity that brooked no compromise. "You can try to tear down this memorial, but you will have to go through me first. And judging by the people standing behind me, you will have to go through all of us." The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming. Applause, cheers, and shouts of support created a wall of sound that seemed to envelope the entire memorial site. Margaret Chin stepped closer to the fence, followed by Robert Torres and dozens of other community members. They were no longer just observers. They had become participants in Drew's protest, willing to put their own bodies between the memorial and the machines that threatened to destroy it. Mayor Hendricks looked around at the assembled crowd, at the media cameras recording everything, at the veterans in their uniforms, and the families with their signs of support. Drew could see the moment when political calculation overcame municipal authority, when the cost of proceeding with the demolition became higher than the cost of reversing course. "The demolition is postponed," the mayor announced, her voice barely audible over the crowd's celebration. "The city council will reconvene to discuss alternative solutions that honor both our development goals and our commitment to veterans' memory." The cheers that followed were deafening, but Drew remained standing in his position until the bulldozer was loaded back onto its trailer and driven away. Only then did he step aside, accepting the handshakes and embraces of community members who had joined his cause. The memorial was safe, at least for now. But more importantly, the community had rediscovered something it had nearly lost, the understanding that some things are more important than progress, and some names are too precious to be forgotten. As the crowd began to disperse and the media crews packed up their equipment, Drew remained at the memorial, standing beside his brother's name in the bronze plaque that would continue to honor his sacrifice. The morning had begun with one man's silent protest, but it had ended with an entire community's declaration that memory matters, that service deserves recognition, and that some battles are worth fighting regardless of the odds. The memorial stood unchanged, its bronze plaques gleaming in the afternoon sun, the names of the fallen still visible for future generations to read and remember. The end.